So Canada has 5 problems that you have to take into account because all of them affect real estate. The first one is geographic and political. The population is stretched out, basically hugging the American border for warmth. And because of the way that Canada was formed as a co-dominion of Anglos in Ontario and Quebecois in Quebec, you have made the decision very early on in your process that the provinces have immense power vis-a-vis the central government. That means you didn't get your first trade deal until about 3 years ago. When I say trade deal, not with another country, within Canada. So internal barriers to trade remain immense, and almost every province in the Canadian system, as this graphic shows, has a greater an economic relationship south with the United States than it does with their own co-nationals. And in that sort of environment, Canada is always going to be incredibly exposed to international trends, especially as involves the elephant next door. Now, you fast forward 10 years, you do away with provincial autonomy somehow, that changes. I don't think that's going to happen in 10 years. Problem number 2 is strategic. This is a Cold War map. All the dots are where the Russians had their military bases. During the Cold War, Canada was in a privileged position. Now, the United States had created globalization in order to build an alliance to fight the Soviets. And whenever we tried to get a trade relationship with other countries, we always had to give in a little bit because we got full security control as a result. So that was the guns for butter trade that defined the Cold War and American strategic policy. Now, Canada, because it's on the flight path for the missiles from the Soviet Union to the United States, could have been a security free rider. You could have been neutral. To your credit, you chose not to. In fact, to your credit, the Canadians were always the first ones for any fight. If they saw a crisis in the world, they'd pick up the phone, they'd call the president, and the first words the Canadian Prime Minister always said is, "We see what's happening, we're here, how can we help?" And that made Canada our fastest friend. But you weren't dumb about it. The next words out of the Canadians' mouth, after all the security details were worked out, be like, "We would really appreciate a little bit more market access for Quebecois cheese, or Ontarian spark plugs, or whatever it happened to be, softwood timber, if you will." On over 70 different occasions, Canada carved little melon scoop exemptions out of American trade law. And all of those were folded into NAFTA 1. And that's how things lasted, until this guy came along. We've been moving away from the globalist approach in the United States for some time, but Donald Trump was the first one to make it the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And he loved Trudeau, because Trudeau was perceived around the world as the only world leader that Donald Trump was smarter than. With that in his back pocket, Trump played hardball on trade negotiations, and all of those exemptions that Canada had spent 40 years building into American trade law were jettisoned in the NAFTA 2 discussions. The only reason that there's even an adjudication function in there isn't because of Canada, it's because Nancy Pelosi put it in at the last second within the US House. Now, as we all know, Justin Trudeau is not the brainchild that is running Canada. That would be Christina Freeland. And at the time that Trump was became president, she was your trade negotiator and ultimately your foreign minister. And she attempted to play the old playbook in the NAFTA negotiations. The idea that Canada has a special place in American trade law and is justified in getting its exemptions. And I'm not saying this to denigrate her. I think she's one of the smartest people on the planet right now. But her first week on the job was Trump's first week on the job. And she was handed a playbook that became obsolete the day she took her office. And so she was pushing for things into NAFTA 2 that the United States had no interest in, on labor, on environmental regulations. And at the end of the day, the Americans got sick of it and cut a bilateral deal with the Mexicans to cut Canada out of NAFTA completely. And this is the photo from the stage when she found out. The Mexican and the American negotiators didn't tell her ahead of time. And after this meeting, she was simply told, the United States is going to proceed with this in 8 days with the Mexicans. You have 8 days to accept the original terms. If you don't, fine, you're on your own. 7 days later, Justin Trudeau signed, and we got NAFTA 2. Problem number 3, geography. What you're looking at here is not a population density map. It is a spatial expansion map. So cities that are in green or blue are not very physically constrained. They can expand in almost all directions. That keeps development costs low. Cities that are in red and orange have difficulty. Maybe they have an ocean or a mountain or a national park or some sort of protected wetlands or something. They can't physically expand very easily, and so their internal land costs tend to be very high. That makes for expensive housing. We've got three trends that are going on in Anglo-America right now, same on both sides of the border. Number one, because of COVID, not a lot of people want to be reliant on public transport. Cities with a circle can't function without city transport, so people are moving out. Number two, the baby boomers on both sides of the border want to move somewhere warm. They don't want to shovel snow in February. They're moving south, or in the case of Canada, west. And then third, the millennials are coming of age. They're raising families, and they want to be in a place where they can have a backyard. They have to move to a place where land costs are lower. So we're seeing people moving out of the coastal cities, and that's on both sides of the border, into the interior, and specifically in the American South, Southwest, and West. You guys don't have a lot of room. I know that Canada is a freaking huge country, but if you start preferencing away from Vancouver and Montreal and Toronto, there aren't a lot of other options. And so you're seeing significant distortions across your entire labor structure. Fourth, demographics. Here's your provincial demographics as of a couple of years ago. You'll notice a couple things about Ontario, Quebec, and BC. You guys have, for the most part, stopped having kids a while ago. You are rapidly aging. Not into obsolescence, we're not there yet. But in this decade, that big bulge of people in their 50s will have moved into their 60s. And then the economic case for the three biggest Canadian provinces gets very, very difficult because you're going to have to tax your young people in order to support your retirees. And if the taxes get too high and the services get too low for the young people, they will relocate. Alberta to this point has been a bit of an exception because of the oil boom and has drawn people in from the other provinces, especially people in their 20s and 30s who are still going to have kids. And that makes Alberta your youngest demographic structure in the entire country. But the housing stock that you have in the rest of the country is not necessarily appropriate for the way your demographic structure is evolving, except again, possibly in Alberta. And that mismatch in an environment of capital shortages, in an environment when we need to double the size of the industrial plant, means that there's a contest for every single dollar that is available for investment. Do you put it into industrial plant? Do you put it into infrastructure? Do you put it into housing? You're going to have to choose. The tar sands boom really got going about 15 years ago. The Albertans were attracting people from all over Canada with a heavy